Any Homo sapiens in the audience? Raise your hands. Just turn to your neighbor, introduce yourself. Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens. It's all Homo sapiens out here, right? Why we prevail. Haven't we prevailed? We have done a pretty damn good job of prevailing. Shall we just all acknowledge for a moment? Why is that? Is it an ego thing? Is it a biology thing? Is it a natural selection thing? I mean, the other hominids, what a bunch of losers. God. Neanderthals. Oh, they had not a chance in the world, right? I mean, Homo sapiens. Of course we would prevail. But there's actually a very interesting scientific set of reasons why we prevailed. It's not fully known why we prevailed. It's a bit of a mystery why we prevailed as a species, because 100,000 years ago, there were all kinds of hominids roaming around. I mean, can you imagine a planet where there are multiple species of humans, all cooperating together, different capabilities, different sort of physiologies, everyone sort of coexisting on the same? Yeah, that's ridiculous. That's no way that would work with Homo sapiens around, right? We had to dominate, and we prevailed. What happened 100,000 years ago or more? The fossil record tells one story, our genetics tell another story, our physiology tells another story, and the climate also tells part of the story of why Homo sapiens is the only hominid species left on the planet. And let's begin with a little video that tells us a little bit about how we got here. Let's listen. So that's pretty clear, right? Yeah. No further explanation needed there. Let's take a look at what this subject actually means and what the science, the current science in paleontology says about why we prevailed, where we came from, and what happened to all the other folks. Our first participant hails from the University of California, Santa Cruz, where he's peering deep into prehistory through a lens no one has looked through until now. He's studying the Neanderthal genome. His work could reveal who we met and mingled with, there's a scandal, as we spread across the globe. Please welcome Ed Green. Our next guest's decades of research and fieldwork have brought a new understanding of when and where human cognition developed. She also argues that there were critical social networks throughout the world of humanids long before Facebook. Please welcome Alison Brooks. I could say Mick Jagger, okay, but I won't. Our next guest is a distinguished two-time Pulitzer Prize winner who has been called one of the century's most influential scientists and thinkers. He is an evolutionary biologist at Harvard, and his newest book, The Social Conquest of Earth, strives to answer the biggest questions of the human condition. Where did we come from? What are we? And where are we going? Please welcome Mick Jagger, E.O. Wilson. And our final guest hails from the Natural History Museum in London, one of the world's leading paleoanthropologists. His doctoral work shows that humans were not descended from Neanderthals. His latest book, Lone Survivors: How We Came to Be the Only Humans on Earth, presents a new theory of human origins altogether. Please welcome Chris Stringer. So, what a thrill to have you all here, and to really begin with the question of 100,000 years ago or whenever, how many different species were there around? And we'll slowly get to the question of what became of them, but we live in a world of just a single hominid species. What was it like 100,000 years ago, Alice?
Well, we had Homo sapiens in Africa of a somewhat archaic version, but nevertheless looking very much like us. We had Neanderthals in Europe and Asia as far east as Uzbekistan, and probably all the way to the western edge of Siberia. And then, thanks to genetic research, we had intimations that there was at least another species in living somewhere in Asia, probably east, southeast, somewhere like that, that we know basically primarily from their DNA, and that's the Denisovans. And then we had a dwarf species of humans living on the island of Flores in Indonesia that you may have heard about as the Hobbit. And that was it's very interesting. It's the Hobbit. Part of the reason for calling it the Hobbit is it's small, but it also turns out to have had enormous feet. So,
an advantage or a disadvantage? Enormous feet.
It was very unclear. It certainly didn't have very much big territory to travel around.
Exactly.
It was on this little island. But
how would you describe, Ed, what was going on, in your sort of supposition about this particular period? Were these groups competing, or were they just, surviving? And we think of them as competing because, certain species survived, certain species did not.
Well, although temporally they were around 100,000 years ago, there were many more players on the scene. Geographically, they weren't, at least at that time, probably living next door to one another, although in the Middle East there could have been the Neanderthal and humans there at the same time. Later, when humans replaced whatever archaic forms were in Africa and migrated out of Africa, they came into contact with these other groups who had, their ancestors had earlier left Africa and colonized Eurasia. And at that time, there could have been direct competition. What we know for sure is that there was at least some admixture, which is a fancy way of saying that there was sex. There was hybrids. There were hybrids between early humans and the Neanderthals and these Denisovans, and we know that because we find the genes of Neanderthals and Denisovans within the genomes of people who are alive today.
And we'll explore that in just a moment when we try to examine the genetic record, but the question really is, where did people begin and why did they move? Chris, is there a way of answering that question? Because there must be many different reasons for why certain populations seem to need to move.
Well, yes, I think one of the most obvious ones is just the need for food. I mean, people are often moving to territories to follow the food. So in Africa, for example, we know there have been major climatic changes. So at times, parts of Africa became very arid. Populations would have had to have moved just to stay alive. And we know that in some cases, obviously, they're following migrating herds of animals. So we see here a possible representation of the spread of humans out of Africa. And of course, we don't know the precise routes in many cases. So there's a leading idea that the movement of modern humans out of Africa towards Asia might have actually gone along the coasts of southern Asia, which is bad news for the archaeology because in the last 12,000 years, the sea level has risen at the end of the last ice age. So many of the sites that would record that are actually under the sea now. So possibly we don't have as much evidence as we like. And this map, a lot of this is based on genetic data rather than really good physical mapping of those dispersals.
Now, I noticed that some of those blue lines actually make it into the water, which would have implied that, you know, we're not walking all the way to Australia, for instance, or...
Well, there were at times, of course, with the rise of the ice ages, so sea level at times was 120 metres lower at the peak of the ice ages. So parts of Southeast Asia that are now separated islands, they would have been joined up to each other. So people would have been able to make their way down Southeast Asia, but certainly to get to New Guinea and Australia, yes, they would have needed boats to get there.
E.O. Wilson, does the fossil record, the genetic record, all the various paleontological evidence pools that we have suggest that everything began in Africa and that hominids were chased out of Africa and then began this parallel evolution in these various locations that we see on the map?
It was a very active theater of species formation prior to that in Africa. So that it's not surprising that the earlier forms, the Homo erectus level, had made it out, for example, and had probably formed new species, including, quite possibly, and this could be ascribed even to an earlier line that went out, that's what the geneticists have to work out, the Flores people. In Africa, what we see emerging as though we were explorers, as though my paleontologists and genetic friends were explorers of the 19th century, first entering the dark continent and working out the distribution for the first times of new species of birds and mammals. They are at a much slower pace because it takes so much more effort to find fossils of the right kind and right age to put the picture together. But they are discovering, one after the other, in Africa, evidence of what we call adaptive radiation. Now, 100,000 years for a biologist considering the origin of humanity is but yesterday. When you go back before, say, several 100,000 years, and then up to several million years, we have much evidence of the Australopithecines that preceded Homo and gave rise to it in a fairly, well, in geologic time, fairly recent period. We see in the Australopithecines, for example, clear evidence of not only the species evolving in a line, one species that evolved in a line that produced such, but there was a radiation of a variety of species. As many as 3 Australopithecines, the predecessors of Homo, that we are sort of limiting ourselves to right now, that coexisted maybe 2 million years ago. So this is the kind of evidence, in addition to descent and then species formation in more recent Homo period, that Africa was a major center of rapid evolution and very extensive evolution of what must have been a fairly successful group, even though in low populations.
Allison, does it seem as though those groups that E.O. Wilson is talking about were competing directly in Africa, or did certain groups have an extraordinary stroke of luck and benefited from either some sort of climate or geography that benefited one group over the other, and that the migration patterns, for instance, were they exclusively motivated by climate, or again, did groups that chose to go to New Guinea have extraordinary amount of luck versus groups that chose to go to Canada?
Well, whoa. If you're starting out in Africa, first of all, I don't think they probably didn't even know they were leaving, unless they were crossing water. I think we're not talking about setting off on an epic journey that's going to take you to the Americas. And the other thing is that to realize that after about 1.2, 1.3 million years ago, we only have evidence of basically one species at a time in Africa, although there are some intimations that there were other more archaic species, just as there were Neanderthals and Denisovans and modern humans in Eurasia for a while. We think that when there were modern humans in Africa, there were probably also archaic ones. And Chris discovered that sometimes you make your discoveries in a museum and not in an archaeological site.
What?
And he discovered an archaic fossil in his own collections.
Go where the fossils are,
year.
right?
But so I think that the climate certainly had a factor, but also when you have to realize that people didn't leave Africa in the sense of they abandoned Africa because Africa was such a bad place to live. They continued to live there in large numbers, but they grew their numbers to the extent that they expanded. The species expanded out of Africa. We're talking about our species now, at the expense of other species for reasons we can argue about. But
so migration was a result of success in the original location. Right. Ed, are there particular theories as to why certain groups didn't make it, why certain groups didn't migrate, or why certain groups that chose to migrate didn't find success in the locations that they went?
So do you mean the Neanderthals? Why they?
The various groups that began to proliferate, along this blue line here.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what the question is, but what we know, as Chris pointed out, we see the earliest routes of humans around South Asia and very early on reaching the islands around Oceania, and then slower filling in mainland Asia and filling in Europe and replacing the other forms that were there.
Talk about the replacement, though. What does that mean exactly? They competed directly and then...
Well, we would like to know this. There are precious few sites where there is evidence of cohabitation, even close in time. Exactly what this... It's something that one can't help but imagine what it must have been like, but real archaeological and fossil evidence of humans, archaic humans and Neanderthals at the same place at the same time interacting is practically absent. But what we do know is that there was some interaction. We also know from the genetic evidence, looking at the genetics of humans who are alive today outside of Africa, that there was probably a single bottleneck, that everyone who is of non-African ancestry is a little bit more related to everyone else of non-African ancestry, and that this was one migration of what would become a very successful group that outcompeted, or however one wants to phrase that, offed the Neanderthals and the Denisovans and all other forms, and is the sole survivor.
How would you, Chris, describe that bottleneck? What do you think happened? Where did it occur? What happened during that particular bottleneck? How many, what was the size of the various populations?
Well, I think estimating population size is really difficult. Geneticists do attempt it, and I mean, the data suggests that all of these human forms were at incredibly low numbers by modern standards. So, we're talking at best tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people scattered over very large areas. So, and at times evidence that some of these human groups came down to just a few thousand breeding individuals. So the Neanderthals, from genetic data, towards the end of their time, even before modern humans arrived and may have competed with them, they already, you could say, were an endangered group. Their genetic diversity was very low. So this seems to have been happening, and I think many people have said that if the proverbial visitor from outer space came to Earth 100,000 years ago, they probably wouldn't have singled any of these groups out as a likely candidate for global domination with the numbers that were around at that time. And in terms of competition and how they actually interacted, as Ed said, we have very little data that they overlapped. We guess they must have, but we have very little data on that. And the views, for example, of the disappearance of the Neanderthals go from one view that, well, when we met them, we just had a great kind of love-in and traded and, mated, and we had a wonderful kind of party with them, and it was all great and peaceful. And at the other extreme, 2 Spanish workers have just published the view that we basically hunted and ate them to extinction. Now, I think, those are very extreme views. I think the truth's going to be somewhere in between, and in fact, there won't be a single reason why, say, the Neanderthals died.
They didn't discover Neanderthal recipes.
There may have been advantages in actually meeting Neanderthals. Of course, they had been evolving in those conditions in Europe for hundreds of thousands of years. The Denisovans, we assume, have been evolving over in Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. So possibly there were advantages in actually meeting these people and exchanging views, and possibly some of the genetic exchanges were advantageous to modern humans. There's a suggestion we got a quick fix by interbreeding with these people to get some immune reactions to local diseases and conditions outside of Africa.
Alison, it sounded like you had a comment there.
Yeah, I think we need to also realize that modern humans did leave Africa more than once, but it's only the last departure that was really successful. So because they do show up in the Middle East around 100,000 years ago, but then they're replaced in the Middle East by Neanderthals after that.
That's a good point, and when we make figures like this, for simplification, to learn it, it's good to draw a single arrow and to learn episodes, but in fact, the history is almost certainly more complicated than that there would have been periods during which people were migrating out. We know that few people are involved because of the massive reduction in genetic diversity that occurred with that, but any sort of temporal arrow drawing that one can do is almost certainly an oversimplification. I had a question also for Chris. So as I understand it, and this is not really my field, but the fossil record is a bit suggestive in that Neanderthals are disappearing from the fossil record in the same temporal and spatial pattern that humans are coming onto the scene. Is there anything that one can safely, a conclusion one can draw from that? What should one read into that about how they were interacting?
Can I just elaborate on that question? So you're asking, the fossil record shows that the population of Neanderthals was declining at the same moment that the population of humans was ascending.
I'm asking this as, is this a true thing? It's something that I have been taught, but not necessarily even declining. It's hard to get a census number, but declining in the sense that it's going to zero, and there are none. The last Neanderthals you find are the ones to the west.
Chris?
Yeah, I think in terms of where the last ones were, obviously, yes, there's a suggestion that they were surviving down in Iberia, Spain, and so on, the longest. But there are large areas of Asia where we have very little data, and we know from DNA data now the Neanderthals got to southern Siberia, so they might have survived in Asia longer than we know about at the moment. But in terms of what was leading to this attrition, if you like, of Neanderthal numbers, the climate was very unstable. We know this, that the ice ages, obviously you get a massive ice advance about every 100,000 years, but also there are these very short-term fluctuations that are poorly understood in terms of the causes. And so every few thousand years, the conditions in the North Atlantic switch from being warm, nearly as warm as they are today, to the Atlantic being totally kind of frozen over. So this influenced certainly Western Europe in a huge way, these millennial scale fluctuations. And the Neanderthals were being hit by these repeatedly. Every few thousand years, the climate rapidly swung to a relatively warm condition, and then a 1,000 years later, back to extreme cold. So when it warmed up, they went north. When it suddenly froze, they all died out in those areas and survived, clung on in the south. When modern humans came in, possibly during one of these brief warm phases, they started to get into Neanderthal territories. And then when things went downhill, that heightened the competition. That's how I kind of see it. In those extreme circumstances, both populations will be stressed. And then the advantage will be to the groups that can adapt best to those rapidly changing conditions. And as Alison may point out, that's one of the things about modern humans, is our ability to change behavior rapidly compared with some of these more archaic people.
All right, we're going to talk about behavior in a moment. Let's finish this particular section, E.O. Wilson, by just sort of recapping. So essentially what the fossil record possibly shows us, and as you say, it's so easy to oversimplify because of a limited amount of data, Ed, but there were many departures from Africa. The fossil record shows a lot of dead ends distributed around the globe of populations that attempted to succeed and did not, but that at a particular point, one of these migrations was absolutely critical, and as you say, Chris, there was an encounter between Neanderthals and modern humans, and the outgrowth of that encounter is what we see in our DNA evidence. That's essentially what we're talking about here. Ed, anything to add to that?
Well, I tell you what, let me just look at this very briefly from the biologist or evolutionary biological point of view. The human evolution, which we see in fragmentary form, does suggest that we were evolving and that we were speciating, that is, dividing into species, in a non-atypical form. When the...
no, wait a minute, non-atypical, that would be typical.
Well, I'm sorry, in a typical animal.
Yeah, you're right. All right, so just,
okay.
yeah.
That's Harvard speak.
Harvard
anyway.
speak, yes. It is Harvard speak.
So what do we have during the Pleistocene? That was critical. There were immense climatic changes. From 2.5 million years ago to 11,000 years ago, Africa went through a series of extreme drought periods. And most likely, human populations were bottlenecked. They were driven into refugia. We know what some of those persistent moist areas are where populations most likely were maintained. When you have that kind of fragmentation of populations, then you have the first stage for species formation. And for genetic diversification, generally of the kind that allows the overall meta-population, you know, the many populations together, to progress quite rapidly. So in this case, the Pleistocene, the crises of the Pleistocene climate had probably an important driving force behind this. And there were multiple species, and there are three things that can happen when you have more than one species. It's very possible that during the Pleistocene there were populations that became distinct species and met, and we don't have evidence of that yet, that there were that many species. We have it further back, but not in this most recent period within Africa. So there are three things that can happen. One, when two species evolve from a single stock in a period when, you know, geographic isolation due to climatic change occurs, then the two can, and this, I'm now talking about animal and plant species, and why not this be the case for humans? They spread in the better times they meet, and they occupy enough of the same niche so that they stabilize allopatria, that is, in different ranges. Or one replaces the other, and that's what appears to have happened substantially. Or what could, certainly would have happened before the Pleistocene in, well, maybe during the later periods of the Pleistocene, in the Australopiths. You get what's called character displacement. The two meet, and they're a little bit different in their adaptations, what they eat, where they live exactly, and so They might coexist, and they tend to displace one another in what they have or evolved to utilize in the environment. They get different niches, and they can coexist. Evidently, in the last period, in the spread from Africa, in that successful founder population, incidentally, that's another principle exemplified. When you see populations being introduced, even in the modern era when they're being introduced as invasive species, we see cases of invasion followed by collapse of the population, and the species no longer there, then another one, and then one takes, and boom, it goes. Well, in the case of coexisting, that's when you have multiple species occurring. When you have one species replacing another, that's just one of a series of outcomes, and suggests that the species involved, at least one of them, was so variable and capable of competition across many niches that it could displace anything anywhere close to it.
So survival,
and I think that's the pattern that was followed.
Survival of the most adaptable. That's sort of the mechanism here. We're going to talk about that physiologically, but just one sort of final point. Takes off. Is that Harvard speak also? Yeah, Wilson? Takes off. I like that. Yeah, very good. I'm going to make that as a ringtone on my cell phone, I think. All right, let's look at the physiology here for a moment. How, if we were, as you say, Chris, if aliens had landed on the planet, they would have found these pathetic humans and gone, well, there's no chance for these folks here. And they would have said, the planet is going to be inhabited by ants, probably is what they, well, that's what you certainly would have said. But if we had been there and seen these various species, what would we have seen in the physiology of Neanderthals and some of the other hominids, as well as the modern species, and what would the advantages have been in brain size or abdominal size? Chris?
Okay, well, I think we've got an image of a couple of skulls that we could put on here. That'll come up, hopefully. Okay, yeah.
There we go.
So this medical technique, CT scanning, being applied to the fossils, and it's really given us a huge amount of information about the anatomy of these people that we just didn't have before. So even the inner ear bones of Neanderthals now, we know what they look like, and they're actually slightly distinct from modern human ones. So we've got a comparison here with the heidelbergensis skull from Africa, which I view as the ancestral species for us and the Neanderthals, and then a modern human on the right there. And we could have picked any modern human. That happens to be an Australian, but equally it could have been an American, an African, a European, an Asian. So we can see there at a glance the differences between these two. So the heidelbergensis skull is certainly thicker, it's longer and lower, the face is larger, more projecting. In the modern human, a globular brain case. The brow ridge, of course, massive in the heidelbergensis, but very small in the modern human. If we had the lower jaw, we would see the heidelbergensis specimens have no chin, whereas, of course, modern humans, you know, we've all got chins. It's a bit variable, I know, if you look around, but in general. So these features that we see on the right there are the shared features of our species. And if we have the skeleton there, then, as we'll see in a minute, the skeleton is lightly built. Now, in my view, all of those shared features of our species evolved in one place, just in Africa. And then when we came out of Africa, that pattern was exported as we spread, and of course it stayed behind in Africa as well. But if we look at what was giving us our success, well, okay, there are some clues. Obviously the brain is somewhat larger, maybe 10 to 20% larger by the time you factor in that heidelbergensis had a bigger body size, so there's going to be a bigger brain, allowing for that. Modern humans certainly have bigger brains. But detailed study shows that there are some subtle differences in the frontal lobes in modern humans and the parietal lobes. The upper part of those is very expanded in modern humans. So these may be clues to something different in the brain, because what we'd love to know is what the internal wiring of that brain's like, and we only have this very crude picture of the brain shape. But it's certainly different between the two. And the fact that our dentition is smaller, our face is smaller, this suggests that we're probably doing different things with our food, processing things differently. What we're eating is different. Our jaws are not so expanded, our teeth are smaller, so we're probably processing our food more as well. And that also is energetically advantageous. The more processing you do on the food before it gets into your mouth, that saves you energy, of course.
Although doesn't it take energy to process the food? I mean, if you're just ripping it out of an antelope,
yeah. But you know, if you can, if you
pretty
can
easy meal.
process, yeah. But if you want your kids to survive, you can process the food for them as well, because that's the most important thing. Is you want the next generation to survive as well. And if we go on to the next image, we can just see.
These are the skeletons.
Yeah, we can see a comparison here now of a Neanderthal, a composite skeleton of a Neanderthal on the left there, and a modern human. And you know, the first thing to stress is Neanderthals are highly evolved humans. They're not missing links. They walk upright as well as we do. They don't have grasping big toes or anything like that. They're very evolved humans, but there are differences. You can see there, these are scaled to the same size. The Neanderthal body is much wider. The wider shoulders, wider hips, a different shaped rib cage, a barrel-shaped rib cage. Very powerful upper body. So Neanderthals were physically very strong, shorter and wider on average than the comparable modern human there. So we, in a sense, in our skeletons, we're wimps. So physically, we didn't have any advantage over the Neanderthals, quite the opposite.
And
in
what
a
about
one-to-one
skull
combat.
size? What about skull size?
Well, the Neanderthals had brains that were as big as ours. Again, when scaled against body size, they're slightly smaller, but they're still very large brains. But again, in brain proportions, it looks like the brain in the Neanderthals was more developed. The occipital lobes are somewhat larger relatively. Possibly that's the visual areas. Might indicate Neanderthals had maybe some more developed visual acuity. But the frontal lobes, some parts of the frontal lobes are reckoned to be somewhat smaller in the Neanderthals.
Alison, how do you formulate the question of what advantages did modern humans have physiologically that allowed them to compete more favorably with some of the alternative species that were around at the same time? Characteristics like wider rib cage or larger skulls. That can be a positive and a negative.
I don't actually think they had many physiological advantages. I mean, the Neanderthals their body plan is adapted to colder environments. That's just like any Arctic animal. They have the lower part of their legs and arms were short. You can see that on here, relative to the body size. Whereas modern humans coming out of Africa, they looked like African mammals. For tropical mammals, they had long legs and arms, which help you lose heat in a very hot climate, whereas short legs and arms help you conserve heat in a cold climate. Neanderthals had bigger bodies, which again helps you hold in the heat. And modern humans had more linear bodies, which helps you lose the heat. So they come into Eurasia as tropical animals. But within about 25,000 years, they've become Eurasian mammals. That is, their legs and arms get shorter. So they adapt to Eurasia. It takes a while, but they didn't come in with those physiological adaptations.
Is any of that detectable from the genetic record, those kinds of rapid, as Alison is describing, physiological transformations?
Well, in terms of the Neanderthal adaptation, we have some amount of sequence from a Neanderthal now. Sadly, this is riddled with errors because of the chemical damage that's sustained to DNA as it sits in the ground for 40,000 years. And asking the question, what genetic adaptations did the Neanderthal have, is not really possible at this time, because every place in the genome, in the DNA sequence of a Neanderthal or a human, where Neanderthals differ from human, it's much more likely that the difference is due to sequencing error than anything else. But what we can do, kind of paradoxically, is use the Neanderthal to say more about humans. We can ask, how do we differ? What changes happen in us recently, even since we separated from the Neanderthals? And there's a pretty straightforward way to do this. Look for places in our genome where the Neanderthal and the chimpanzee are the same, and where humans are different. And then those are things that have changed recently since we split off even from Neanderthals. And it's very early days in trying to understand what regions have changed in humans in a way that gives us an indication that perhaps there was an adaptive benefit. But coincidentally, one of the genes that in a first pass screen looking for things where all humans have changed a lot since we split from Neanderthals turns up a gene that has to do perhaps with this difference in bell-shaped rib cage, which would lead one to speculate that that may have been an adaptive benefit. And what that means when the rubber hits the road is that if that's true, that people would have died if their rib cage was not shaped more like the modern human, or at least they would have left less descendants than people who had the more archaic form, which is a strange thing to think about, how that could have actually increased one's fitness, leaving more offspring or keeping you alive when other people who had the more bell-shaped rib cage would die.
Well, let's do the adaptivity game in reverse. We can actually speculate as to what, say, I would have looked like as a Neanderthal. We can actually map my characteristics onto what we understand to be a Neanderthal skull and get a sense of, there you go. Yeah.
Yes.
Clearly an improvement. And we've taken the liberty of doing it with you, Allison. Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. Okay.
I smiled.
All right. And we even tried to do it with you, Ed.
Great.
Barely had to do much there with Ed. Yeah. The question is, with such a radical difference, and you're the one who suggests that the genome record indicates that there was clearly intermingling, can you imagine dating? Given those images? What would have brought these characters together, and what are the circumstances where this intermingling might have taken place? And again, it's a family show.
Have you ever heard of the Kinsey report?
Yeah, that's just anthropology, not paleontology, right?
I think the the barrier of would you do it is not one that we need to consider, really. That obviously people would, and even stranger things, given the opportunity.
We're downtown. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah. I did see once a study, and I'm blanking on who did this, but it was a comparison of Neanderthalizing features of men and women, and then asking men and women, would you? For the female Neanderthalized faces of men, and then for men of women, to see if there could have been perhaps some sex bias in gene flow in Neanderthals. And I think the result of this was not surprising, that men probably are a little more likely to do this. But we don't see any.
So it's so sad. But thankfully, it's why we're all here, I guess.
Yes. There's no, I should say seriously, no great evidence for sex bias in the amount of admixture thus far, although the tests for looking for that are admittedly very weak right now. There's not any smoking gun hard evidence that it was just Neanderthal men and modern human women, or the other way around. There were at least some of both.
Do these kinds of encounters, E.O. Wilson, produce greater genetic diversity? Is this an adaptive mechanism, or is this more of an accidental kind of thing that may or may not confer an advantage?
Well, it's both. You know, when the breakout occurred 60,000 years ago, the one that really went worldwide, there was an enormous increase in mutations of genetic diversity in that spreading population. And it's interesting to see what the consequences were of that. If I can be corrected because I've only read this. So my understanding is that we became the population, the founder populations that made it over and spread, then acquired a much larger diversity of genes. But as it turned out, most of these genes were not very obviously adaptive. Some were, but they mainly had to do, or they mainly provided a clear selective advantage, that is, advantage in survival, in two ways. One was increase in diet, just the adult lactose tolerance genes, 3 times in Africa, once in Eurasia, appeared and allowed dairying to occur. The other category in which we increased greatly in our genetic diversity was disease resistance. But correct me if I'm wrong, Ed, and Chris, there was very little evidence of cognitive change at this microevolutionary single gene change level.
Well, we'll talk about the cognition and sort of cultural dimensions of this.
I mean, in mental.
Ed, it sounds like you want to.
Mental propensities. We know there's an amazing thing about human population, worked out by a team of about 50 geneticists a couple of years ago, working in 44 different countries, using the 5 basic personality traits that can be measured by psychologists. And the idea was to compare societies all around the world, in every continent, with one another, to see if there were, in fact, differences in these personality, in the distribution of these personality traits, like extroversion, introversion, openness to new experience, tendency to neuroticism, and so on. And we know there's a fairly hefty level of what's called heritability within each one of those traits, within a single population. A lot of that variation is heritable. That is, it's, passes down in families. Well, the amazing discovery was that around the world, it was just about the same. Just the same amount of variation, approximately, in every population around the world. So this is rather extraordinary. And much
you wouldn't have expected all the neurotics to be in New Guinea and
no, every
boring people to be in Canada, although there is some evidence of that.
Well, I didn't want to go into New York City in the very place where we said, well, anyway, the point is...
Although on the distribution...
the point is that people are much the same around the world, and we don't know exactly why that's the case, as to why it evened out like that. But we did go through a lot of genetic variability change, and the product in the end was pretty much the same everywhere.
Ed? Yeah, so this, there are scans for selection, looking for regions in our genomes, finding genes where there has been some adaptive benefit. Sadly, the most powerful tests for doing these contrast different groups, look for local selection. So compare the allele frequencies, how often different variants occur in this population versus this population. Sadly, those can only tell you about differences that have arisen since those two populations have been separate and undergoing different selection regimes.
Give me a concrete example of some sort of characteristic that
the poster child example of this is the one that Ed mentioned, lactase persistence, and it's independently come up several times. The most well-studied, perhaps, instance of this is at high frequency in North and West Europe, and can even be dated using a variety of methods to something like 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, and is consistent with the archaeological record of the onset of dairying. And it makes a coherent, complete, consistent story that at that time there was great need for vitamin D, and one way to get it is to keep the gene on that can digest the sugar in milk and drink milk as you suffer these terrible winters there. And the idea is that somebody had a mutation that figured this out genetically. They left more descendants. Other people died because they didn't have that variant. The person who did left more descendants, and it came up in frequency. We can see this. It stands out like a sore thumb in the genetic variation that exists in that region in people in Northwest Europe versus people in the rest of the world. But that is a contrast. That's describing something that happened 7,000 or 8,000 years ago.
Yeah, that's recent.
That didn't help us beat the Neanderthals,
right,
if in fact any genetic variant helped us beat the Neanderthals. And these are the things that we can find easily, contrasting human populations. Looking further back in time is a more difficult thing.
Allison.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, while we're on the topic of variation, that the greatest human genetic variation is in Africa. Only a few Africans left Africa and gave rise to the rest of us. They were not more closely related to the rest of the Africans than, in fact, everybody outside of Africa is much more closely related to one another than to many of these populations that stayed in Africa. So these subsequent variations that developed are very, very interesting, but not perhaps the bigger part of the human variation story when you look at the whole species.
They're interesting to look at, but they probably aren't decisive and aren't responsible for the way we are today, is sort of what you're saying.
Well, they're responsible for the way some of us are today.
Right.
Those of us who drink milk, for
yeah,
instance.
for those of us who drink, yeah. Chris?
I mean, something that might be relevant, I put Ed on the spot really, it was said that there are some differences maybe in neurotransmitters between the modern and the Neanderthal genome. Is that significant, do you think?
Would love to know the answer to that question. So one of the big open questions of research topic that my group and several groups are working on is what was the function, what was the adaptive benefit when we can see some sign for adaptive benefit in humans versus Neanderthals. It's a pretty straightforward conceptually thing to do, to look at the variation of all humans. We get more and more and more DNA sequence data. We have, one estimate was 30,000 complete human genomes have been sequenced now, and many thousands of these are publicly available. Anybody can look at them. You can go home and download them on your computer now. So we can look at where every human that you look at is different from this Neanderthal. And these are enriched for regions where something came up that was so important that in our history that you would die if you didn't have it, and it came to fixation. And we're trying to make sense of many of these. Some of them are in genes that have been linked to neural development. One big caveat over interpreting any of this is to be honest about my profession, that we don't know what most genes do. And it's a sad thing to say this as a geneticist, but there are about 20, 25,000 genes. We can't even agree exactly on what that number is in the human genome. And most of them, we might have some clue as to what they do because we have inactivated a homologous gene in a fly or in yeast and have some idea what it's involved with. Or there may be people walking around today who have a naturally occurring variant in this that alters slightly the function of the gene, and we can see what the disease manifestation of that is. But most genes, there is very, very little data about what they do. So we can screen across the genome and say, well, this region that has these genes may have been undergone positive selection, but what those genes do is a hard question to answer, much less what the adaptive benefit in this slight variant is. So but there's a lot to work on.
The bad news is there's not a lot of clarity. The good news is it's really easy to get published on a lot of information, right?
Yeah, well, we have a joke that you can just put Neanderthal in the title of any paper and it goes into Nature or Science.
It doesn't work for the non-geneticists, I have to tell you.
Look, you know, let's come out of the fever swamp of population genetics and ask the question, seeking the reason why the Neanderthal didn't make it. Speak to the diet of the Neanderthal. Weren't they specialists on hunting and meat eating?
That's more a question for Chris.
Well,
or
go for it, guys. Hey,
I mean,
I'm just a Homo sapiens.
We could eat a lot of different things if we were more vegetarian. Is that possible?
I mean, Alison can come in and add hers to this, but from my point of view, yes, I mean, modern humans broadened the diet even more than Neanderthals. Yeah. So aquatic processing, marine resources, Neanderthals did a little bit of this, but it wasn't a major
What's
part.
aquatic processing? Is that fishing?
Yeah, fishing. Yeah.
For God's sake.
Sorry, I'm slipping into Harvard speak. I apologize. More Harvard speak there, I'm sorry.
That's torture.
Yeah. Fishing.
Aquatic.
Very good.
What do you say we do some aquatic processing? Huh? I'm using worms. All right, anyway, sorry.
I still have not heard the answer to my question.
Okay,
yes, let's go. Alison,
broader processing of many different kinds of foods. And with modern humans, you've got things like traps and snares and nets. Yeah. And these help you gather food in all kinds of ways, which Neanderthals probably couldn't. And I'm sure Alison can add to this.
I think they were more efficient at getting their food. But I'm not entirely convinced that they were eating different things. I think within modern humans today, if you look at hunter-gatherers, if you go from very arid environments to slightly less arid environments, in arid environments the meat consumption is higher because there are long periods of the year when there's nothing else to eat. And if you go, say, to the edge of the desert, there's more vegetables that are available year-round. If you look at Arctic populations versus North Boreal populations, the people who live in places where there are vegetables always eat them. And what we find, we thought that Neanderthals were basically exclusive carnivores, which seems improbable because if you actually try to live, has anybody ever gone on the Scarsdale diet or the Atkins diet? If you try to live on protein, you lose weight because you simply aren't, you're not creating enough or priming the digestive mechanism that allows you to digest all that protein. So what happens? You have terrible stomach upset and you lose weight. And it's not healthy.
It's a strain on kidney function.
It's a strain on everything. So they couldn't have been, if they're humans or related to us, they could not have lived only on meat. And indeed, we discovered, this is research I did with one of my students, discovered that if you don't go to a dentist, the stuff builds up on your teeth, right? You get all this, the plaque turns into tartar, it's very hard. And
you did this to one of your students?
And the dentist, no, we borrowed dental picks from my dentist, and we went off to scrape the teeth of first modern humans, then old modern humans, and then old Neanderthals, and discovered that the starch grains from what you ate are still on your teeth 100,000, 130,000 years later. And so this is how we discovered that Neanderthals not only were eating plants, but they were cooking them. And in Iraq, for instance, Neanderthals were eating barley porridge. And we thought, well, maybe that's just the ones who lived in the Middle East, where the climate was really good. But we also discovered that Belgian Neanderthals, who lived on the edge of the ice, were eating water lily roots and beans and all kinds of plants. In fact, everywhere we find that the grasses, the wheat, the barley, the rye, the whatever, form a considerable percentage, in fact, the majority of the starch grains we find on the teeth, and that they all eat legumes like beans and peas and underground storage organs like tubers or carrots or turnips or whatever.
And is this evidence of a diet managed through agriculture or pure opportunism?
This is purely wild food, no agriculture. But that that's the plant component of the Neanderthal diet was not tiny. And we're trying to figure out why other tests are telling us that they ate a lot of meat. They probably did eat a lot of meat in some seasons of year, but they certainly consumed plants whenever they could.
All right, so it's not diet is the short answer. Go ahead, Alison.
But I do think that the modern humans had technology, as Chris was implying, that allowed them to get a more consistent, reliable, balanced diet. They were outcompeting the Neanderthals on getting the food.
Now, as in our culture, in our period here in the 21st century, technology may be a marker for brains being turned off. In fact, technology in the period that you're talking about implies triggers of cognition, consciousness, and culture that I suspect we like to think of as an advantage for Homo sapiens. But what do anthropologists think about cognition, culture, and these questions of technology use? Chris?
Well, yeah, I think that one thing that modern humans did, and it's more a social thing really, was we're great networkers, and I think that gave us an advantage. So if we look at the archaeological record, and I'm sort of getting onto Alison's territory here again, but there are long periods of what you could call relatively slow change in the stone tools through hundreds of thousands of years. Then when we get to modern humans, particularly in the last 100,000 years, we do see certainly a build-up of more rapid change. And I think that reflects social changes, because archaic humans, even probably including Neanderthals to an extent, were living locally in smaller numbers, and they weren't networking to the extent across the landscape with other groups. Modern humans, increasingly in Africa and then exported from Africa, are living more densely and networking, covering wider ranges in trading with each other, signaling to each other with shell beads and red ochre, probably, pigments. And this means that good ideas can take hold and spread, and that's what we find today. Good ideas today are conserved and they spread like wildfire. That's because there are lots of us and loads of ways of storing the information, and it wasn't like that in the distant past. But when you get to modern humans, we start to see that accumulation of ideas within groups because they're networking with each other, and also there's a much greater generational transfer. It's not till we get to modern humans that you find a lot of old people preserved in the fossil record. So the good news is for the elderly that they were certainly useful.
Elderly were a marker that culture was actually happening. Can we be more precise about when culture began, other than tools kind of going viral?
Well, I think that you see different aspects of behavior changing over time, and we keep pushing these things back. So. Yes, as Chris mentioned, we have, if we work backward from the time when modern humans have taken over in Europe and the Neanderthals are essentially disappearing, that's the period in Europe where we have the great cave paintings. I don't know if, some of the things that we think of as the sort of acme of Stone Age achievement.
So what are we looking at here?
What we're looking at here is a painting from Grotte Chauvet in France, in the Ardèche. And these are dated to somewhere in the early 30,000s, maybe 32 to 35, somewhere in there. Our radiocarbon dates are less precise than we'd like them to be these days because there's a big argument about how to prepare the samples before you get to the date. But this is an extraordinary painting of lionesses, probably hunting, and it's in a cave that is a treasure trove of paintings like this. And we have evidence of all kinds of images. And there's been an argument that this was an explosive development after humans left Africa and confronted the cold. Weather, I have Russian colleagues who, not surprisingly, think you have to have cold weather to develop a fully modern culture.
Well,
but
of course you do, yes.
But the fact is, and I have another picture from a different part of the world, from approximately the same age. This is a painting of a human. Notice that the legs on the left are human, and the creature on the right is an animal. So it's a human who seems to be transforming into an animal. And that's a very common theme we find in this very early art.
And where is this from?
This is from Namibia in Southwest Africa. It's also 30,000 years old or a little bit older. It's recently been redated to that time period. And there are a couple of images from that cave like this, and then there's another one that is working its way to publication. And I think these are in a late Middle Stone Age type setting, but they are dated to more or less the same ballpark as the Chauvet paintings, but at the other end of the world. So what this says to me is that the people who left Africa were part of a tradition that could do this if they had to. This isn't something that developed only among the people who left. This was already there. So then we have to go back and say, where did this begin? And if we go back before this, we see that there are not images before this, but there are geometric designs on ochre, and there are shell beads.
So artifacts, costume artifacts indicate a culture trigger taking place. And these are, where are these from here?
These are from the southern tip of Africa at a place called Blombos, which is right where Africa comes to a point down at the bottom. And if you look at them very carefully, you can see, I don't know if you can see this in the picture, but one of the things about these shells is that they've all been perforated in a place that would enable them to be strung, but it isn't a good place. If you're a marine snail predator interested in eating another snail, You're not going to make a hole in its lip because you're not going to get to the other snail that way. You're going to go for the body. So these are possibly, arguably, maybe the perforations are made by humans. But what we can see in these perforations is that they're all polished on one edge, particularly the one in the upper right. Has a polished edge that can only come from wearing it on a string for a long time. And they also have some microscopic traces of red ochre on them, which come from wearing them on a string on a body that has red ochre paint on it. So it's quite likely that these are people who had a very rich array of symbols that told you, as soon as you saw them, who they were. And they said, I'm a whoever, I'm a Southern African from Pinnacle Point.
Date this for us. And
this is about the same age as the beads. It's about 75,000 years old. And so this is one of these geometric designs. And there are several others from this cave and other sites where we have some sort of design. It's not an image that we recognize as an animal, but it's a design that's been placed on a little slab of ochre about this big. And the argument here is that people are making durable symbols in some way that carry information about who they are or about something in their world that was important. And the fact that they are able to walk around with these symbols on them or to leave them in places where other humans are going to come along and find them and say, you know, it's like Kilroy was here. And, you know, it sort of says, it might have said, the beads might have said, I'm married, you can't have me. Or it might have said, I'm a big chief or a big important person.
Or purely marking territory.
Or just marking territory.
And I think it's just worth saying that this, in a sense, doesn't do justice to the object, because when that was freshly done, it would have been a vivid red, blood red, you know, colour.
Right.
Yes. Was there Neanderthal art?
We can go back in Africa. One of the things I just wanted to say from some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing, we can now go back in Africa and find the shell beads go back to 90, 100,000 years ago. It's more or less the same kind of shell all over Africa and into the Middle East, but it doesn't really mean that it's not a symbol of identity, because you could arrange the shells in a different way, as people do today with glass beads that are the same all over the world, but the design is what matters. And the other thing is we find ochre, not necessarily with designs on it, but ochre that has been ground on a grindstone into powder much, much earlier, even before we have Homo sapiens. We have sites with kilos or pounds and pounds and kilos of ochre that somebody has brought in, and it's usually preferentially red ochre, or sometimes purple, but never, or much more rarely, is it yellow ochre. And we're testing the ochres and finding they're all pretty much effective for any technological use you can think of for ochre. But
well, let's speculate on what those uses would be. Are we talking about a medium for making durable markings, drawings, images, costuming, cosmetics?
Well, ochre can also make acacia gum elastic so that you can haft an arrow or a spear point onto a haft. But it turns out, and we have these arrow points with ochre traces on them, but it turns out that yellow ochre is just as good as red ochre for this purpose. It's some experiments we've been doing this year. But the red ochre is almost always preferred, and often from very distant sources.
Let's step back for a moment and try to ask the question, what was going on? You say there's now evidence of some sort of cultural emergence that goes back before Neanderthals vanished, that suggests that there was a cultural trigger that took place maybe 100,000 years ago, maybe more. Can we ask the question, the species that developed culture first had an obvious advantage over the others, and that was going to determine why that species survived and the others didn't? And Ed's question here, Could Neanderthals have had a culture? Could another species have had a culture? And if they had developed it first, would they have been the winners here? Is there any way to even speculate about that, Allison? And then let's get a comment from everybody.
Culture is a very difficult term to define. There are a lot of people who would argue that chimpanzees have culture because the chimpanzees in one place use tools differently or they shake hands differently from chimpanzees in another place. But the kind of elaborate symbolic culture that we're talking about only occurs in humans. But it also, Neanderthals did have pigments. So this is something that's very old in humans. It does go back to 300,000 to 200, 300, even 400,000 years ago. We have this big increase in ochre. As soon as Homo heidelbergensis probably came along, they began developing this kind of culture. So when Neanderthals left Africa, they had, or when the line leading to Neanderthals and Denisovans left, they had some rudimentary ability for symbolic culture, and this is reinforced by the fact that they also share what was thought to be an important gene that controls for language. So yes, they were on this, they started out with the same abilities, but African humans went further in developing them.
Gene for language, Ed?
Yeah, FOXP2 is the gene in question here. This is a gene whose function is known because there is a family in the British Isles, I think, that has an inherited disorder. This family, you knock out one copy of this gene, and the disease phenotype is that people have a hard time processing speech and language and some other more subtle aspects of the phenotype, like they have a hard time keeping a steady rhythm. This is somehow related to only having one copy, active copy of this gene. This gene is also interesting. It was way more interesting maybe 5, 10 years ago, because if you look at the version of this gene, FOXP2, in humans and compare it to the chimpanzee version, there are two differences in a region in this gene that's otherwise really highly conserved, even out to mice. So mice have this gene. The function of this gene, more generally, is that it binds DNA and turns on other genes. So it's one of these regulators of gene function. So it has some crucial differences, perhaps even since chimpanzees, and we know something that it's related to speech and language. It's one of the first things we wanted to look at in Neanderthals. In fact, we went and pulled out the DNA for this gene before we even got the genome and found, quite to our surprise, that these two differences are shared with the Neanderthals, and we know now they're also shared with the Denisovans. So whatever benefit towards speech and language this gene confers was shared with the Neanderthals. But having said that, speech and language are almost certainly, they are multigenic, highly complex traits that aren't just the result of a single gene. So if Neanderthal, it's a huge, interesting, open question, and I would love to hear everyone else's opinion about this, whether or not Neanderthals could talk. And is this the conduit of networking, of cultural transmission that you envision? If they could talk, then perhaps that's not the reason why we beat them, but if they couldn't, then it's an obvious candidate, and that's not my idea. That idea has been around for a long time, that they were deficient in this way, and we were not. And it was, if you think about all the things that you know, and calculate how much of that you figured out yourself versus was told to you, it's obvious how important this is, speech and language, and being able to communicate through language. It's what makes us so incredible. Were Neanderthals incredible in that way too?
Which came first, society or the language, Chris?
Well, I think they evolved together, really. I mean, my view is that language evolved out of social interaction and social complexity, and I think Neanderthals must have had some form of language. As we've heard, they're using pigments, they're well adapted to their environment. They're burying their dead. I mean, there are a few people who doubt that, but I think they were burying their dead. And that level of complexity, I think you have to give them language. But of course, it's difficult for us to envisage another kind of human and another kind of language when there's a gulf between us and chimpanzees, but 100,000 years ago, there were these other species around, and Neanderthals had evolved separately from us for several 100,000 years. As Alison said, I think both groups, both species, as I'd call them, were going down the road of increasing complexity, but we went further down that road.
So what was the accelerator for modern humans? Was it population density? Was it language? E.O. Wilson?
Yeah. Well, let's now introduce, I mean, this has been brilliant. I've learned more from these people than that's not in most of the journals I've been looking at, and it's just wonderful. New insights. It's dispelled possible hypotheses that have been circulating along. But I want to bring up the dark side. The dark side is group competition. And when you look at the historical record and then traces of what might have been going on even into pre-humans, we find that we are an intensely aggressive species, and that group conflict is fundamental to humans, leading up to constant episodes of tribal replacement, genocide, and so on. And we know, coming back now to the driving force of social evolution, it would appear that group selection is a very important fact of the origin, at least of Homo sapiens. And what does that do in its consequences? Well, a number of things. Intense group selection, group against group, would include the development of a couple of traits which would include the tendency toward interneting, networking, and also of an intense, two things that are intense. It's intensely human in modern humans that could be a result of this. One is that we are extremely group conscious. We must belong to a group. We form groups quickly. We know from psychological tests that people, for any excuse, will form a group. And when you form them...
And when you say group, you mean different than kinship,
group
family?
That distinguishes your aggregate, familial or beyond, from other groups. And psychologists have run experiments in which they've set up arbitrarily chosen groups. That is, membership is arbitrary and random. And as soon as they set up a group, even in a simple experimental situation, people quickly identify readily with that group and come to regard the other randomly created group in playing simple games as suspicious.
So the propensity here in New York to say, the qualities here in New York of saying the people in the Meat District are cooler than the people on the Upper East Side, and the people in Brooklyn are cooler than all of the rest, that's actually an evolutionary, that is a feature of humanity.
It's a general quality of groupishness. That is to say, seriously, we are constantly in the process of forming groups, of expressing loyalty to groups, and this is, I think, one of the products of intense group selection, which involves aggression among groups. The other one that's developed is our intense interest in each other. That is, humans spend an enormous amount of time trying to figure out what other people in their group is doing and judging. Gossip is an extremely important adaptive phenomenon. Well, we think these are so natural to us that we don't think of them really as evolved adaptive traits. And I'll just bring that up then, that this could be one of the products of an extreme aggressiveness that Homo sapiens had that maybe our other hominine rivals did not have.
What do you think?
I just throw that in, and I would love to hear what the experts here present say about that.
I have a slightly different take on the groupishness issue. I think that what humans, if you look at what we were doing at the time of the exit from Africa versus what Neanderthals were doing, one of the really striking things is that for a couple of 100,000 years at that point, we had been developing social networks. And the way we trace this on the ground is by looking at how far people are going to get the stone they're making their stone tools out of. After all, we don't have much material to work with here. We don't have the people. We don't have the DNA most of the time.
Text messages are gone.
Text messages are gone, right? No email. So what we're seeing is that beginning before, let's say, 340 to 400,000 years ago, around then, people are beginning to bring in stone from considerable distances on a regular basis. 50, 60, 70, 100 kilometers away. The stone is coming in on not just a piece here and there, not just a finished tool here and there, but masses of it. And this is implying that there's a network, a supply network going in a bunch of different directions, that you've negotiated the right to go to someone else's territory because those are much bigger than a typical human foraging range would be. To go to someone else's territory and get some of their stone, you'd have to let them know before that they shot you.
Log in, get a password.
That you were a friend and not a foe. Yeah. So we also see, this is when the pigment comes in as well. So I think we're seeing a completely different approach to social organization in the modern humans than, and these aren't even modern humans yet, than we're seeing in the Neanderthals. Neanderthals simply did not do this. So they don't have these long-distance contacts. And I actually have a colleague who thinks that Neanderthals may have had the ability to form a language, but they didn't have the same vocal tract that we have. So they couldn't make the same kinds of, I don't know what Chris thinks about this, but the sounds may have been a little bit less distinct. So I asked one of these guys once, well, what did you think the Neanderthal sounded like? What would it have been like talking to a Neanderthal? And he said, did you ever talk to a 2-year-old? It would have been like talking to a 2-year-old, only his mother can really understand him. So, Neanderthals might not have been as facile at making friends who lived a considerable distance away and had a different accent.
Although I do have a 2-year-old who's evolving very quickly at home now, and before I go back to see him, let's have a conclusionary thought here on the question of how well we're doing as residents of this planet, 7 billion of us. Do we see the adaptations and what's going on now as a sign of success? Obviously, population is a sign of success, but are there signs of us possibly making some of the same mistakes or experiencing some of the same stresses that you have observed in early humans in a very, very different setting on the planet? How do you think we're doing, Ed?
Well, I think just in terms of census population size, we're off the rails. This is unprecedented. If you compare current humans with all previous humans and what we think their census population sizes are, and all other great apes who are alive today, it is the really big brain revenge of the nerd story. There's 7 billion of us and maybe 100,000 of the most populous great ape. Those guys, not only we crowded out all the other hominin forms, but we're on our way to crowding out all the other great apes. And so our biggest danger right now is really our success, I guess, and that we are taxing, people hear this all the time and it sounds preachy, but we're taxing the world in a way that it's never been done before. So hopefully we're smart enough to figure out a solution to that problem.
At lunch today, Allison, you said that Darwin had something to say about the prospect of humans coexisting with perhaps other similar species, and that that seemed very, very unlikely in your view, based on our history. In answering the same question that Ed answered, do you see the possibility of us coexisting with another species? Is the fossil record an indication that we're good at that sort of thing, or is pretty much the big D dominance all we do as Homo sapiens?
I don't think that that we do well at coexistence. I mean, if you think about what we do to even other populations of our own species, when you meet another population, there ends up being one group that dominates the other, either as they enslave them, they resign them to a lower caste, they form some kind of very specialized symbiotic relationship where one group of humans from one group looks down on the other one. So there's always an asymmetry when two modern human groups meet. And you have to think what would happen if it were really another species.
So were the other species kind of like the peaceful hippies, and we are much more the aggressive, must dominate? Or is that a feature of hominids generally, that there can be no stalemate based on what you've studied?
I think, well, in some ways, it doesn't seem that we're born to be peaceful hippies, I have to say, sadly. That it just, we can try, and maybe we can succeed, but it hasn't happened very often in the past.
Chris?
I think that's the story.
Well, something even more controversial than human evolution and population size is, of course, climate change. And I do think that in the immediate future, that's a really huge threat to us. And we need to do something about that, or human numbers will be very seriously threatened in the future. We're going to go through, I mean, we've seen lots of climate change in the past, and humans have got through it, but we're heading into new territory with the predicted rises people are talking about. Large areas of the tropics and subtropics could end up being uninhabitable. So that would drastically change our future, and I think, I'm somebody who believes that really is a threat.
And some of the same dramas and stresses that you've observed as a paleoanthropologist may be in our future, even all 7 billion of us. E.O. Wilson, take us out. What do you think? How are we doing?
Well, we're an extremely aggressive species. And that aggressive displacement of populations, even of our own genotype, exists along with the long trading routes you mentioned. They are consistent. Genocide accompanies the trading, or is preceded by it, or goes along with it. It's a kaleidoscope of aggression, alliances, constantly changing borders. As William James said, history is a bloodbath, and we should see that as a powerful generating force for what we are. If that trait is specific to our species as opposed to those competitors that fell before us, that could explain a lot. And until we know exactly what was the origin of those patterns and how extensive they were, going back into prehistory, we may not have a definitive answer of why we now stand alone. But what is also worrisome is we see our population rising to 10 billion, but then probably peaking and starting to come down by the end of the century, is that we are in the same manner destroying the rest of life, such that by the end of the century, if we don't rein in now, we will lose up to half of the species of plants and animals on Earth. So we are very reckless. We are off the rails, that's true. We are a mix of wonderful, virtuous, and also murderous traits, and we've scarcely begun to understand why that is so.
And that would be the bad news, but the good news might be that if we don't make it as humans, Homo sapiens, and the planet survives, the paleoanthropologists of the future are going to have a whole hell of a lot of fossils and stuff to deal with. They're going to have a party, that's for sure. Chris Stringer, Ed Green, Allison Brooks, and E.O. Wilson, thanks so much. And thanks to all of you. It's been great.